Hello and welcome to Decoding Risk, where we bring you expert insights on trending topics in the insurance industry. I'm your host, Edward Pronley, the Marketing Operations Manager here at Fusable, and today we're talking about what's happening in the trucking space from a regulatory standpoint. Joining us for our episode today is Chad Krueger, our Vice President and Managing Director of our Risk Intelligence here at Fusable, as well as Steve Keppler, the Co-Director of Scopelitis. Welcome to you both.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Edward.
Now, Chad, you've been a recurring guest on our show before, but this is Steve's first time joining us. So, Steve, do you mind giving us a little bit of your background?
Sure. Thanks, Edward. Appreciate the opportunity. So I'm co-director of Scopelitis Transportation Consulting. We work with a lot of fleets and insurance providers, suppliers of the industry, do a whole host of different things, really focused on safety and compliance primarily. I've been in the industry 34 years, started with FMCSA years ago, doing compliance investigations and roadside inspections and regulatory policy and research work. And I've been in different organizations, nonprofits over the last couple of years. But after that, working for primarily the biggest one is Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance. I was there for 16 years and the executive director there for 6. Worked with the Intermodal Association and technology and transportation. So I've had a good mix of government and nonprofit and private sector experience. So
Absolutely. Yeah,
my gray hairs, my gray hairs show it.
Yeah, Steve,
I think it's
Chad
going to be
knows.
Steve's got a lot of knowledge, and obviously we're very, very happy to have his expertise on this video.
Oh, absolutely. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So, Steve, could you get us started with what's happening in the trucking space right now from a regulatory standpoint?
Well, I think we had a new administrator from FMCSA that was confirmed in the fall, and so he's been pretty aggressive at moving forward on a number of fronts. I would say the focus thus far has been more on enforcement than the regulatory side. Now they have implemented a couple of pretty significant rulemakings over the summer. One was for the medical integration rule that basically, where drivers, the CDL drivers, their medical certificate is integrated with their license. And that was a pretty big change. Still have some bumps in the road there that we're dealing with. And probably the other biggest one is a non-domiciled CDL rule that is still in debate. And we should know here very shortly what happens with that. There's a final rule that's supposed to go into effect on the 16th of March. But there's some court action that needs to be taken, and that's probably going to happen pretty close here. So we'll know pretty soon. They have been doing some deregulatory actions that came out. President Trump issued an executive order early on in the administration that said, agencies need to focus on, what they can pull out of the rule book. And many agencies across government have been doing a lot of that. I think FMCSA is a little bit the exception they've been enforcing a lot of things. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but I expect, and we'll talk about this more later. There are some rules coming that I think people need to be aware of that we'll get into later.
So, as this enforcement is increasing, how is that showing up in core safety programs like roadside inspections and investigations?
Well, I think what you're seeing is a focus on carriers that are what I would call high risk, those that have demonstrated safety problems. So you're seeing more investigations on kind of agents being a little more data driven. They're taking enforcement action based in some cases off of roadside inspections for driver specific type of issues, what's called red flag violations. So we're seeing some of that, with some of the changes with non-domiciled CDL and immigration related issues. We're seeing some roadside immigration enforcement where some states are working with ICE to really address those issues. And so we're seeing more of that out in the field with states. But I think by and large, a lot of the focus is surrounding driver credentialing issues, whether it's the license, are they properly qualified? Are they proficient in English language? How have they been trained? What training schools have they gone to? And so that seems to be a focus right now. and so that'll continue, I think, for foreseeable future based on what I can see. But I think there is going to be a shift to more carrier focused investigations in pretty short order.
So, Steve, one of the things you mentioned is that they're trying to be much more data driven, and we're certainly a very data driven organization with CAB and Fusable as well. Can you expand just a little bit more, talking about, you had mentioned how they're using more data to go after drivers and things like that, and obviously Administrator Bill Barr is a big driver behind that. Can you just expand a little bit more on that again from our the realm that we're in? Those are certainly things that people are very interested in understanding.
Sure. Well, CS. There's several ways of how they identify carriers and drivers for what's called interventions, right? And so CSA is a big driver of that. And so every month, there's the SMS algorithm that sits behind CSA that does a ranking and scoring of all of roadside inspections, of crash data, of past investigations. Every month, there's an analysis that goes on, and every carrier in the census, in the database, is put into one of five buckets based upon their performance. And so that drives agency decisions about who they're going to investigate. Obviously, those that have more problems in those seven basic categories are going to rise to the top of the list for intervention. They also have what's called the driver safety measurement system that exists. A lot of folks don't know about, that ranks all the drivers based on driver performance. And so they're using that tool to identify drivers when they're conducting the investigations. They're looking at the drivers that are higher risk, that work for those carriers. And so they're looking at those specific drivers when they do the intervention. So it's really data driven because they have about, between the federal government and the states, maybe 14 plus thousand people that do commercial vehicle enforcement, of a census that's, 750,000 motor carriers. So they can't see everybody. So they have to have a means with which to target to the best of their ability. And they're really using CSA as a big driver of that.
Thank you.
Speaking of just the federal government, looking back at this administration's first year, can we talk more in more detail about what some of the prominent agency actions are that have taken place?
Well, I think, I talked about the Trump executive order that came out, focused on, called Common Sense Rules of the Road for Truckers. It was talking about English language proficiency and reviewing the commercial driver's license program in the states and non-domiciled CDLs, improving the working conditions for drivers. Out of that executive order, Secretary DOT Duffy came out with a pro-trucker package in the summer of last year to address things like expanding truck parking. They withdrew a speed limiter rule, again, part of the deregulatory action, and initiated a number of other deregulatory actions on 20 different rules, saying they're going to take on the whole issue of brokering and double brokering. They said they're going to move forward on some pilot studies on hours of service to provide more flexibility. They're doing some other things with data queues changes and trying to make that so. So that really was a kind of the if you will, the roadmap for the agency. And I will say, in my 34 years, I've never seen a DOT secretary focus on trucking the way this one has. And so it's giving a lot of kind of room to move for FMCSA. There's other things that the English language proficiency enforcement, that's really ramped up since the summer of last year. They've been doing auditing entry-level driver training schools and removed a number of those schools from the training provider registry. They're focusing more on electronic logging devices enforcement, both at federal level and state level, and removing ELD providers from the registry. They've done commercial driver's licensing program audits on the states and have issued 24 issues of letters of noncompliance on non-domiciled CDL issues. And again, in my history of being in this area, actually withheld federal funding from California, and I've never seen that before.
Yeah, I
Um,
think California just had a couple of. I think they just came through. CCJ mentioned that they had a couple of suits that they ended up losing just very recently within the last day or two.
yeah, so and that's the other thing on the CDL stuff. There's a number of lawsuits kind of trickling around right now that against California, against FMCSA, and that's what we're going to know pretty soon what's going to happen there. So they're voiding driver's licenses for drivers that are non-compliant. So there's a lot of, like I mentioned, enforcement actions that the agency's using under current authority, and the best they can to address some of these longstanding issues that have been around for a while. And I think if most of the industry is supportive of a lot of these things that the agency is doing, because it's rooting out some of the bad actors that have been around for a little while.
Yeah, and I think the ultimate goal is they're trying to make sure that we've got the best, most qualified drivers operating good, safe motor carriers and things like that. And a lot of these changes are going along with that philosophy.
Yeah, for sure, and a lot of it's been driven by there's been some bad crashes over the last 6 months or so that have exposed some of these things that is keeping a lot of these issues in the media. You're seeing it in a lot of places in news organizations that typically don't cover trucking issues. So and it's keeping the pressure on to work on this. So
So it sounds like there's been a lot that the federal government has obviously done in this new administration so far, and I think what you've mentioned multiple times now is the commercial driver's license and a lot of the regulations surrounding that. Is there anything that carriers can do to prepare for these types of commercial driver's license regulations and these new levels of inspections?
yeah, I think there's a number. I mean, the first and foremost is you've got to have a good program of oversight over the qualifications of your driver, and that's not just when you're hiring them, making sure you've got good hiring standards, you're following the rules, you have good hiring criteria, but also while they're driving for you and making sure you've got good oversight, because again, that's a focus area. Whether it's for example, on the English language issue, there's been federal guidance, enforcement guidance put out about what they're going to be what they're expecting for a compliance standpoint. So carriers should be making sure that their programs and policies can properly account for that. For the non-domiciled CDL issue, the projection there are about 200,000 or so drivers that fall into that bucket, and based upon the rule changes that the FMCSA is trying to promulgate, a number of those drivers will not be allowed to renew their CDL, their non-domiciled CDL, when it comes due for renewal. So making sure you've got a good handle for those carriers that employ those drivers that have those licenses. Make sure you understand, what the rules are, and each state's handling a little differently. And so make sure that the state of issuance for those drivers, you have a good handle on how they're handling it, because some are using prior rules with regards to non-domiciled CDL. Some are using the proposed rules at FMCSA. Many of them are not issuing new ones. So there's a lot of things that are up in the air right now, due to all the litigation that's going on. So it's really important that you're staying on top of your driver qualifications in particular, right now.
So we've mentioned a lot about new rules for drivers. How have rules surrounding ELDs or electronic logging devices? How have those changed or evolved, and how are they being enforced differently?
So there's been, because of the big emphasis on enforcement, with ELDs over the last couple of years, there's and FMCSA has been doing a number of investigations on some of the ELD providers and the ELD registry, and have discovered, between cooperation with the states, a lot of fraudulent activities going on with ELD providers and some carriers. And so that's really ramped up enforcement. And so they've really been focused on that as well the last 6 months. They've removed some ELD providers from the registry. They've also implemented a new vetting process, regarding ELD providers. So they're trying to identify some of those fraudulent providers early on in the process, and also those that are existing on the registry. Enforcement's getting smarter about identifying these things in the field, and so you're seeing more and more revocations of ELDs that our FMCSA is doing. They do have right now, it's a self-certification program for those providers that are wanting to provide that service. FMCSA has indicated they want to remove that self-certification program and move to a more robust program, possibly third-party certification. They also have on their docket to do this summer a revision to the ELD rules in general. They've been in effect now for about 6 or 7 years. And so they've learned a lot along the way. So that's on their docket to address that. Canada, for its part, is in the process of changing its rules around ELDs as well. So you're going to see, I think, continued focus on ELDs, both from enforcement as well as possible rulemaking coming forward.
Are carriers experiencing the results of these rules yet, or are there still gaps the FMCSA is trying to close?
I think it's a little of both. Particularly with the NR2 rule and the non-domiciled CDL rule, it's been a challenge for a lot of carriers because on the NR2 rule, not every state deployed it at the same time. There's still some states that haven't affected the rule. So it's been challenges with some fleets, and there were errors and challenges with data transmission. And so drivers were having challenges, even though they were medically certified, because of some of these data gaps and states not have implemented the rule. They weren't fully compliant. So FMCSA has had to issue several waivers over the last couple of months to allow drivers to continue to carry their paper medical card. So that's been challenging for some fleets and frustrating, honestly, because they're having to run multiple MVRs. They're having challenges with working with the DMVs. And the non-domiciled CDL issue, similarly, states are doing things a little differently because the rules are up in the air to some degree. And so it's really been challenging for a lot of fleets to try and get a handle on this. Because the other thing that really has complicated the non-domiciled CDL issue is, a lot of the impetus for these rules and change are really immigration related, and historically that's not been connected to safety and the driver's license. And so there's employment law issues that carriers really need to be careful about, that they don't overstep their bounds when they're looking at those drivers and their qualifications. So really need to be careful that you're not going too far, because there's discriminatory practices that could come into play here. So really you need to be careful about that. And if you're not consulting your internal counsel, um, you can certainly come to the Scopelitis law firm and and they'll help you out. So
But
Absolutely.
stuck between the proverbial rock and a hard place, right?
it really is. And I think that's one of the challenges that you're seeing here with the enforcement, is it is creating some confusion with a lot of fleets and drivers and frustration. So you need to mind your P's and Q's on the compliance side, more so than ever, because of these ambiguous and confusing things, and the regulators being in different places at the federal and state level. You still could be exposing yourself to liability issues, regardless of what the regulators are doing. So you need to be careful, not just on the regulatory side, but also on the liability side.
And there's a business saying, when you're trying to affect change in an organization, you move fast and break things. And I think there was that's part of what we're seeing here, where it's if you're trying to fix something quickly, you run into these kind of situations. It's not always very comfortable, but if we want to affect change for the better, that's kind of the spot we're in right now.
No, it's a good point, Chad. You're right. And the different administrations have different approaches to how they tackle things, and you can affect change in different ways. And I think it's certainly waking a lot of people up that probably been sleeping for a while on this, and it's probably in the whole scheme of things is probably a good thing.
And I think from where we're coming from on the data side of things, as much as again we're working on the risk side of things, as are you. I think it's really woken up a lot of the partners that these motor carriers work with, whether it be insurance or financial or truck rental and leasing, whatever it might be. I think it's really woken people up to the importance of understanding these motor carriers better, whether it be chameleon carriers or anything else, to make sure that they're working with the right folks.
No, you're right. I mean, I think, Chad, and interesting you bring that up because I just read a report last week that was put out by an organization that looks at shipper sentiment, right? Customer sentiment on how they're viewing transportation. And interestingly enough, what they're seeing from a lot of the shippers is a much stronger focus on compliance and safety scores and financial stability of the carriers they're using than ever before. And again, I think that's a good thing, right? Because
Absolutely.
it's and so I think all in whole we're going to get to a better place, but for a little while it's going to be bumpy. And those bumps probably have needed to happen for some time.
So, coming up, moving into year two for this administration, what are some things we might see in terms of new regulations or initiatives? And will we see any further changes to the industry from year one regulations?
Well, like I mentioned, I think it's been a strong enforcement focus, but I think we're going to be shifting to regulatory issues because one of the things that came out of the Trump executive order on this deregulatory issue is if you're going to implement a new rule, you've got to take away 10. So that's across the federal government. And so I think that's why, in many respects, you saw the first year of trying to address the deregulatory actions so they can meet that executive order mandate, if you will. So that's you're going to be seeing a shift to regulatory, I think, and part of that. So I think there's several things in play. You've got things like marijuana rescheduling that could impact on drug and alcohol testing, and fentanyl added to the list. So that is, and you're seeing there's hair testing that has been asked for by industry for a while, and I think you may see that come into play. Oral fluids testing, again, still in the drug and alcohol testing realm. Um, you're going to see changes to the CSA program, I think, come into effect. That's not a rule per se, but it is going to have a dramatic shift on industry operations and how others view industry. So I think that's been a long time coming. That's probably going to change. You've got other things that are on their docket, like the safety fitness determination rule that could change safety rating process. That could be tied into CSA. We don't know, maybe. Um, there's things like CDL knowledge testing in English, which is some of that's come out of Congress, some of that's come out of kind of groundswell support. The states are looking at these things too. You're going to see, because of the chameleon carrier issue that Chad talked about, I think you're going to see some changes to registration and revocation processes for some of these chameleon carriers. New entrants, I think you may see some rules there, wrapping a little bit tighter, the requirements for new entrants entering the industry, whether it's knowledge requirements and testing. I think you could see some action on brokers. There's some things on the docket regarding broker financial responsibility and transparency. I think you could see some action on kind of these removing these self-certification programs with ELDs and entry-level training providers, and moving those into more of a certification model. Um, so you've got these pilot programs for hours of service, like I've talked about. So you're going to see, at the same time, you've got rules. Many of these are intended to help advance safety. Some of them are attempting to address flexibility. And so I think you've got a lot of things. I think, and wrapping it all on top of this, we've got Congress considering a highway bill change. So every 5 years, Congress institutes a new highway bill that really authorizes the programs for transportation and FMCSA to move forward with. So you've got a number of bills being introduced in Congress right now that will be part of this highway bill, and things like truck parking, tort reform, autonomous vehicles, English language proficiency, stop underride issues, predatory litigation. So there's a number of things that Congress will come forward with and introduce as part of its highway bill, because the current authorization for all the DOT programs expires September of 2026. So Congress has to enact this within by September. Ideally, they can extend it, but that's the goal. And so that, on top of all these rules, you certainly could see some changes that come from that legislation.
I've also heard that states are experimenting with new tech-based enforcement models. What trends are you seeing at the state level that could become national norms?
So it's interesting. So the last highway authorization bill, the one that's up for renewal, the bipartisan infrastructure law under the Biden administration, authorized and appropriated huge new amounts of money to the states as part of that bill to do a lot of things. And one of the things that it did is provide a lot more funding to the states for people, but also for technology and other tools of the trade, if you will. So you're starting to see that funding come into fruition with a lot of at the state level with things like size and weight enforcement technology, things like tire anomaly and classification systems that look at tire wear and tread depth and flat tires. You're seeing work zone enforcement solutions come into play to help, because trucks are very overrepresented in work zone crashes. So you're seeing states implement work zone warning systems and also enforcement systems. You're seeing distracted driving enforcement tools come into play where there's camera-based solutions that are taking images of drivers while they're driving to see if they've got distractions going on. You're seeing speed enforcement happening all across the country with automated speed enforcement. And also, there's a program that's going on right now with level 8 electronic roadside inspections. There's an operational test going on to look at the future with respect to how we advance the roadside inspection program and how we can maybe use electronic inspections at highway speeds to help facilitate that. So there's a lot of things that are coming to fruition that are helping enforcement. It gets back to what Chad talked about earlier, this data-driven approach. It's not just at the federal level, it's at the state level as well. And they're much more effective at targeting the problems that they see that are contributing most directly to crashes.
So, with all of these new monitoring tools and data driven enforcement approaches that we see emerging, do you see the FMCSA moving toward what I have heard being called a beyond compliance model? And would you be able to explain more about what that is?
Sure. Well, so it's it actually was mandated by Congress in the FAST Act in 2015 that the agency implement a beyond compliance program. And at its core, it's an incentive-based program, right? To incentivize non-regulatory in nature, right? It's to incentivize industry to invest in things that can enhance safety. We know many carriers are doing a lot of things that aren't required by regulations, right, to advance their safety programs, whether it's, ADAS systems, advanced safety technologies, whether it's enhanced training programs for their drivers, whether it's camera-based systems. These things aren't required by rules, um, but fleets are doing it because it makes safety sense. And so, but right now, those carriers aren't getting recognized for those investments. It's having direct correlation to improve safety, right? But they're not getting recognized or acknowledged for those investments because CSA is backward looking. It looks at what happened in the past. It looks at violations, it looks at crashes, whereas many of the things I just mentioned are more forward looking. It's looking at leading indicators, like speeding, erratic lane changes, following distance, things like that we know impact on crashes. So the goal of beyond compliance is to, you know, we talked about all the sticks that are going on, right? All the enforcement that's going on. Well, we need to offer more carrots, right? We need to give carrots, and we know from our experience, and Chad can probably acknowledge this too. When you're trying to implement policies and things within fleets, drivers are much more interested and likely to change behavior based upon positive reinforcement than negative, right? They're going to respond to rewards for things and probably change their behavior versus getting slapped on the wrist. And so what beyond compliance does is the S in FMCSA is safety. It's not an E for enforcement, right? So safety is not just about compliance; it's about much more. And so that's really what beyond compliance is about. It's let's move the needle on safety by really acknowledging this huge new trove of data we have that we can prove our safety performance. It's not just an idea anymore. We can prove that we're safer. And so why not give the carriers that are doing those things and having those results, why not recognize them? Because they're making change without federal intervention, frankly. And so like we've talked about, there's only limited federal resources at the and enforcement. Let's leverage the power of industry to do and empower them to do these things on their own, and leave the guys that are doing things right, leave them alone, and so enforcement can focus on the one they need to, right?
Absolutely. Well, Chad and Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we end it, are there any final words that you would give on the current state of the industry and its regulations? Maybe any advice you could give to carriers to kind of help navigate this?
Pay attention to what's going on.
That's great advice.
Yeah,
You are absolutely correct.
and do your research, right? There's a lot of misinformation out there. Make sure you've got legitimate resources and access to resources before you're making decisions, and leverage your partners, right? Leverage, many fleets. It's not, they just don't have themselves to do their business, if you will. They're using partners like Fusable, like other vendors. Leverage those vendors to help you, because they're there to do that, and take advantage of that. You don't have to do it on your own. There's plenty of people. You can run your business, but leverage those vendors that can give you that intelligence to help you be safer.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of Decoding Risk. I'm Edward Pronley from Fusable, Steve Keppler, the co-director of Scopelitis, and Chad Krueger, the vice president and managing director of our risk intelligence here at Fusable. Thank you so much for tuning in, and be sure to catch our next episode. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.